Here is something nobody in the media will say out loud. The most powerful geopolitical story of 2026 isn't what you've been told it is. The viral videos have racked up millions of views. The thumbnails are dramatic. Trump in a suit, a map of China, British flags dissolving into dust. The titles scream, 72 Hours, How Trump Ended 300 Years of British Power. And millions of people watched, nodded, shared, and believed. But what if the entire narrative, the 72 hours, the British Empire collapsing, the single masterstroke, is a ghost story dressed up as geopolitics? What if the real power play is happening somewhere quieter, somewhere most people aren't looking, and it's far more consequential than any 72-hour ultimatum ever could be? To understand why this matters, you have to start where the myth starts. Not with Trump and not with 2026, but with opium, warships, and a dynasty on its knees. In 1839, the British Empire did something that, even by the ruthless standards of 19th century imperialism, was breathtaking in its audacity. It went to war with China to protect its right to sell drugs. The Qing dynasty had banned the opium trade, a trade the British East India Company had built into a machine of extraordinary profit, flooding Chinese ports with opium grown in British India and watching millions of Chinese citizens spiral into addiction. When the Qing emperor cracked down, Britain sent warships, and China, armed with medieval weapons against modern naval artillery, never stood a chance. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing, a document that historians now call one of the original unequal treaties. China was forced to pay a massive indemnity, open 5 ports to British trade, and cede a small rocky island that nobody in London particularly wanted at the time. That island was Hong Kong. What followed was a century and a half of British commercial dominance in the region, a dominance built not on mutual prosperity, but on the barrel of a gun and the economics of addiction. Here is the fact almost nobody knows. The word compradors, the Chinese middlemen who facilitated Western trade, became so synonymous with collaboration under colonial pressure that it entered the Mandarin language as a permanent stain, a nation's humiliation encoded in its own vocabulary. But here is the thing about that 300 years of British power that the viral videos keep invoking. It didn't end in 72 hours in 2026. It ended on the night of June 30th, 1997. At midnight, in a ceremony watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world, the Union Jack came down over Hong Kong, and the 5-starred red flag of the People's Republic went up. Prince Charles stood in the rain. The last British governor, Chris Patten, wiped his eyes. And with that handover, Britain's final sovereign foothold in China, the last physical remnant of the Opium War empire, ceased to exist. Whatever British power in China once meant, it was archived in 1997, not dismantled by a trade memo in 2026. So then what exactly are all these videos talking about? The thesis of this episode is simple, and it is this. The 72-hour China Gambit is a media myth with a real event at its core. And conflating the myth with the reality is not just intellectually lazy, it is strategically dangerous. Because while millions of people are watching YouTube thumbnails about an empire that fell 30 years ago, the actual reshaping of global economic power is happening in regulatory dockets, summit frameworks, and trade investigation filings that almost nobody is reading. Let's start with where the 72 hours framing actually comes from, because it isn't invented from nothing. It's a recycled trope with a specific origin. On July 22nd, 2020, the United States government ordered China to shut down its consulate in Houston, Texas, and gave Beijing exactly 72 hours to comply. The stated reason was espionage and intellectual property theft. The real-world effect was immediate. Within days, China retaliated by ordering the U.S. consulate in Chengdu to close. It was a sharp, kinetic moment in an escalating cold trade war, and the 72-hour deadline had a kind of cinematic clarity that lodged itself in public memory. Fast, decisive, dramatic. 72 hours. Content creators noticed. The 72-hour framing is a proven engagement hook. It implies a countdown, a ticking clock, a decisive moment of confrontation. It maps perfectly onto the action movie grammar of the modern internet. And so when the Trump administration's trade policies began escalating sharply through 2025 and into 2026, the 72-hour Gambit label got reattached, this time to a sprawling, multi-front economic campaign that has nothing cinematic about it whatsoever. It's a myth built on a real precedent, stretched to cover a reality it fundamentally doesn't fit. It is worth noting, too, that the digital environment in which this myth spread was itself shaped by the very U.S. China tensions it claimed to describe. TikTok, the platform built by Beijing-linked ByteDance and used by over 170 million Americans, was under a de facto nationwide ban from January 2025 until January 2026, reinstated only after a deal that prohibited ByteDance from controlling content recommendation algorithms in the American version of the app. That is not a footnote. That is a signal. When a government moves to sever the algorithmic pipeline through which a foreign adversary might shape domestic information consumption, it is telling you something about how seriously it takes the information war. The 72-hour Gambit videos proliferating across YouTube and X are the other side of that same coin. Domestic content that feeds an appetite for aggressive, triumphalist, anti-China narratives. Narratives that in turn give the administration the political cover to pursue hardline economic policies. The myth and the policy are not separate phenomena. They are symbiotic. Now here is what is actually happening, and this is where it gets genuinely important. On March 11th, 2026, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the USTR, filed a document that received almost zero mainstream media coverage. It initiated Section 301 investigations into what it called structural excess capacity across more than 15 major economies. The docket number is USTR-2026-0067. And if you want to understand American economic strategy toward China in this moment, that document is more important than any viral video. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 gives the U.S. government sweeping authority to investigate and respond to foreign trade practices deemed unfair or unreasonable. It is the legal foundation for tariffs. It is the architecture of leverage. And in 2026, it is aimed squarely, though not exclusively, at Beijing. The numbers in that filing are staggering. In 2025, China's global goods trade surplus hit a record high of over $1.2 trillion. $1.2 trillion. That figure represents nearly 70% of all global goods trade surpluses combined. China is not just exporting products. It is exporting overcapacity. Its factories are running at 74.4% utilization, meaning more than a quarter of Chinese industrial capacity is producing goods that its own domestic market cannot absorb. Those goods, electronics, steel, automobiles, plastics, machinery, flood global markets at prices that domestic manufacturers in the United States, Europe, and the developing world simply cannot match. This is not natural comparative advantage. This is state-subsidized industrial warfare, conducted through supply chains instead of soldiers.
That is the real Gambit. Not 72 hours. Years.
Decades of strategic industrial policy, and now a direct American counteroffensive using the most powerful non-military tools Washington possesses. And simultaneously, while that Section 301 investigation was being filed, U.S. and Chinese negotiators were sitting down together in Paris. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and China's Vice Premier He Lifeng were mapping out a framework for a full bilateral summit scheduled for late March and early April in Beijing. The agenda is not peripheral. It covers tariffs, fentanyl supply chains, Taiwan, and, critically, advanced semiconductors, specifically the kind made by NVIDIA. These are not the conversations of countries heading toward 72-hour ultimatums. These are the painstaking, high-stakes negotiations of two superpowers who know that a genuine rupture between their economies would destabilize the entire planet.
Now, let's be fair to the other side of this argument,
because the people sharing those viral videos are not wrong about everything. There is a real and serious argument that the Trump administration's posture toward China represents a historic inflection point. The Liberation Day tariff announcements of April 2nd, 2025, in which the U.S. slapped a 10% baseline tariff on imports from virtually every country on Earth, with far steeper rates aimed at China, did represent a fundamental break from the post-Cold War consensus that global free trade was both inevitable and desirable. The argument goes, Trump didn't just change policy, he changed the paradigm. He looked at the architecture of globalization that the Western liberal order built over 70 years, decided it had been a bad deal for American workers, and started burning it down. And in doing so, he reshuffled every established power relationship, including, indirectly, whatever remained of Britain's post-imperial commercial networks in Asia. There is something to that argument. The post-1945 liberal trade order did benefit former imperial powers, including Britain, through institutional continuity, through the WTO, through financial networks, through the lingering prestige of English as the language of global commerce. When that order fractures, some of those inherited advantages fracture with it. But here is where the argument collapses under its own weight. Attributing that fracture to a single 72-hour move, or to Trump alone, or to a sudden dismantling of centuries of British power, fundamentally misreads causality. Britain's decline as a China power was not caused by Trump. It was caused by the Suez Crisis in 1956, which shattered the illusion of British imperial capability. It was caused by decolonization, by the economic decline of the 1970s, by the negotiated handover of Hong Kong in 1984, signed by Margaret Thatcher, completed in 1997 under Tony Blair. Trump did not end British power in China. History ended it. Trump is managing the aftermath. And here is the revelation. The single thing that, once you see it, changes how you understand this entire moment. The viral 72-hour Gambit narrative is not just wrong. It is a distraction that serves specific interests. When audiences consume geopolitics as a highlight reel, 72-hour ultimatums, dramatic flag lowering, empires crumbling overnight, they become incapable of tracking the actual mechanisms of power. And the actual mechanisms of power very much depend on that incapacity. A regulatory docket filed by the USTR on March 11th, 2026, targeting China's $1.2 trillion trade surplus, will affect the price of every television, every car, every solar panel, every piece of industrial equipment that enters the American market. It will reshape supply chains that employ millions of people across dozens of countries. It will alter the competitive calculus for manufacturers from Malaysia to Mexico. But it has no thumbnail. It has no countdown clock. It generates no viral content. And so it is invisible to the very people whose lives it will most directly change. Meanwhile, a summit between American and Chinese negotiators in Paris, the kind of careful, multi-stage diplomatic choreography that serious geopolitical realignment actually requires, gets zero coverage, while a YouTube video about 72 hours and British ghosts racks up 1 million views before breakfast. This is the information environment in which global power is currently being redistributed. And the people who understand that gap, who know the difference between the story and the policy, are the ones who will be positioned to navigate what comes next. The ones who don't will wake up one day and find that the world changed while they were watching a thumbnail. The British Empire in China didn't end in 72 hours. It took 1.5 centuries to build, a century of decline to dismantle, and one rainy night in Hong Kong in 1997 to formally close. What is happening now in trade dockets, summit frameworks, tariff schedules, and semiconductor negotiations is something genuinely new, genuinely consequential, and genuinely complex. It deserves better than a countdown clock and a dramatic thumbnail. It deserves exactly what it almost never gets: your full, undivided, undeceived attention. Don't watch the clock. Read the docket.